Alright, so one of our topics for this week is to learn more about behavior theory and different clinical approaches that incorporate aspects of behavior theory. Some of this might be a bit of a review for you guys from past psychology classes, but hopefully you'll get a better understanding of how it relates to OT practice. After this presentation, you should be able to define and describe common behavior paradigm techniques, explain the basics of clinical approaches based on behavior theory, and describe the complementary aspects of ABA therapy and OT practice. Behaviorism is a term used to describe how humans develop through conditioning and learning, and it equates learning with behaviors that can be readily observed and measured. As you can see here, there are several theorists who have contributed to our understanding of behavior therapy, and I'll be presenting behavior concepts from each of these theorists throughout the rest of the presentation. There are several techniques common to the behavioral paradigm, and the first one listed here is respondent conditioning, which is also known as classical conditioning. Classical conditioning suggests that learning a new behavior occurs through the process of association. There are 3 stages involved in classical conditioning. In the first stage, which is before conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response in an organism or an individual. This means that a stimulus in the environment has produced a behavior which is unlearned, otherwise known as unconditioned, and therefore is a natural response which has not been taught. In this respect, no new behavior has been learned yet. In the second stage, or the conditioning stage, a stimulus which produces no response is associated with the unconditioned stimulus, at which point it now becomes known as the conditioned stimulus. In the third stage, which is after conditioning, the conditioned stimulus has been associated with the unconditioned stimulus to create a new conditioned response. And the most famous experiment with this was Pavlov's dogs. If you Google other examples of classical conditioning, you can find several other videos or descriptions of this behavior technique. Next is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a type of learning where behavior is controlled by consequences, specifically positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. Positive reinforcement strengthens a behavior by providing a consequence an individual finds rewarding. An example would be giving a child a cookie after they eat all of their vegetables. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an adverse stimulus which is rewarding to the individual. It strengthens behavior because it stops or removes an unpleasant experience. An example would be lifting regular TV restrictions once the child eats their vegetables, or if they eat their vegetables. Punishment is defined as the opposite of reinforcement since it's designed to weaken or eliminate a response rather than increase it. It's an aversive event that decreases the behavior that it follows. Positive punishment is used to decrease the behavior and is presenting something unpleasant after the behavior. A very classic example that I would not recommend, though, would be spanking a child when they do something wrong. Another example could be giving an extra assignment to a child if they act out or hit someone during class. Negative punishment is also used to decrease behavior, and it's removing something pleasant after the behavior. An example would be giving a child a timeout during free play if they hit during class. So here again you can see that spanking is a good example of positive punishment, but not one that I recommend. And then just be considering whether timeout is positive or negative in terms of a punishment. Now, I'll quickly describe the rest of the common behavior techniques on this list here. Task analysis is really similar to activity analysis in that you're breaking down the steps of a task or steps of an event to understand what goes into it. Extinction is the disappearance of a previously learned behavior when the behavior is no longer reinforced. Shaping is gradually working to change a response by rewarding segments of a behavior. So you're working towards the complete behavior. So an example would be rewarding a child sitting down in front of vegetables first, and then rewarding them for smelling the food, and then rewarding them for picking up the fork, and so on and so forth. Fading is gradual reduction of prompting and rewarding so that the child is doing things more independently. And chaining is teaching steps one at a time, so as in teaching links in the chain. And there's forward chaining and backward chaining. In backward chaining, the teacher or the therapist is doing all steps of the task except for the very last one. The child completes the last step of a task. And with forward chaining, it's the opposite. The child completes the first step of the task and then gets assistance for the rest from the caregiver or therapist. There are several clinical approaches based on behaviorism, including applied behavioral analysis, or also known as ABA, discrete trial training, positive behavioral intervention and supports, and naturalistic developmental behavior interventions. So the following definition of ABA comes from Autism Speaks, which states that behavior analysis focuses on the principles that explain how learning takes place. Positive reinforcement is one such principle. When a behavior is followed by some sort of reward, the behavior is more likely to be repeated. Through decades of research, the field of behavior analysis has developed many techniques for increasing useful behaviors and reducing those that may cause harm or interfere with learning and functioning. ABA is the use of such techniques and principles to bring about meaningful and positive change in behavior. A key aspect of ABA is conducting a functional behavior assessment. In a functional behavior assessment, you observe behaviors to examine relevant antecedents and consequences to help determine the quote-unquote function or the why of the behavior. It stems from the idea that both desirable and undesirable behaviors are learned and maintained through interactions with one's social and physical environment. There are many possible causes for the negative behaviors we observe in the children we work with, including, obtaining desired events, or escaping or avoiding undesired events, or having an inability to communicate. Also, some antecedents may be related to some sort of sensory issue. But how do we as therapists tell if a child's observable reaction or behavior is truly due to a sensory processing issue and is not just purely a behavior? This can be really tricky to tell the difference between, and one of your online activities for this week is to read an excellent blog post from a popular OT blog called The Anonymous OT about this very topic. Also, reviewing the Analyzing Behaviors checklist, that's one of your online activities for this week, will also help you to better pinpoint how to determine if there's any sort of sensory processing issue contributing to behaviors. In the end, it's important to know when to refer to behavior specialists, and it's always beneficial to use an interdisciplinary approach to manage problematic behaviors with kids that you're working with in your practice. Going back to the clinical approaches, the next is discrete trial training. This is a method of teaching in which the adult uses adult-directed mass trial instruction and reinforcers chosen for their strength and clear contingencies and repetition to teach new skills. At the end of the presentation today, I'll go back to this YouTube video and you'll be able to watch an example of discrete trial training. Rather than target individual behaviors, the pivotal response treatment, or PRT therapist, targets pivotal areas of a child's development. These include motivation, response to multiple cues, self-management, and the initiation of social interactions. The philosophy is that by targeting these different critical areas, pivotal response treatment will produce broad improvements across other areas of sociability, communication, behavior, and academic skill building. Positive Behavioral Intervention and Supports, or PBIS, is a school-wide approach to make schools safe and promote positive behaviors. It's also a way for schools to decide how to respond to a child who misbehaves. It's based on principles of ABA and focuses on prevention of negative behaviors while also emphasizing consistency of approaches throughout the school, meaning all teachers and classrooms are using the same types of behaviors. Naturalistic developmental behavior interventions refers to a variety of approaches that borrow some ABA principles and apply them in a natural setting with more child-centeredness. So pivotal response treatment is an example of a more naturalistic developmental behavior intervention. You'll be reading an article this week for one of your online activities about the argument for the use of ABA therapy in OT practice. ABA is a predominant intervention approach for individuals with autism and has shown strong evidence for treating symptoms of autism and helping individuals with ASD meet their goals. And yet there's almost no mention of the use of ABA within OT literature. The most commonly used intervention approach for individuals with ASD by OTs tends to be a sensory integration approach, which, as you guys have learned, has fairly weak evidence. So why aren't OT practitioners who work with the ASD population incorporating ABA into their practice? The article you read will shed some more light on that question and discuss how ABA and OT may be more complementary than meets the eye. But some common criticism of behaviorism is that it's denigrating to the human spirit, it turns individuals into robots that can only perform on command, and that individuals aren't able to learn how to generalize skills to other settings and situations, and that it's not client-centered and therefore does not take into consideration the inner motivations and interests of a child. So these sort of misconceptions about a behavioral approach may be why some OTs or many OTs aren't thinking to incorporate this approach into their practice. Again, you'll be able to read an article about this and we'll be discussing it together in class on Monday. Currently, the acquisitional frame of reference is the most common formal integration of behavioral approaches used within OT practice. However, it's important to note that several of the frames of references that you've learned about this semester include some aspects of behavior theory. The bottom line is that if behaviors are interfering with successful engagement in occupations, it's important for OTs to explore and understand the possible reasons for the behaviors and how to address them. When faced with problematic behaviors, we must decide how we will go about either stopping or eliminating the behavior, altering or replacing the behavior, limiting the behavior, treating its primary cause, or ignoring the behavior. But harm to self and others must always be addressed immediately. In wrapping up, I hope you feel that you've developed a foundational understanding of behavioral theory, which may have been, like I said, a review for many of you. As stated, behavioral concepts are interwoven into many pediatric OT frames of reference, and we'll be hearing from the group this week to learn more about specifically the acquisitional frame of reference and how it's used in practice to promote skill acquisition. Don't forget to complete the other online activities for this week. And now let me go ahead and grab that link to show you this video. Oh, I have to get out of here. Let me grab this link so I can show you this video that offers an example of discrete trial training.
Unit 3, Discrete Trial Teaching. Section 1, The Discrete Trial, SD, and Response. In DTT, the discrete trial is used to teach new behaviors. The definition of a discrete trial is presenting a learning opportunity in which the student's correct response will be reinforced. The discrete trial consists of 3 parts which correspond to the ABCs of behavior. These parts are the discriminative stimulus, or SD, the response, or R, and the stimulus reinforcer, or SR. Here's an example of a discrete trial. Look at me. Good looking! High five. As you saw, the SD was the instructor saying, "Look at me." The response was the student looking at the instructor, and the stimulus reinforcers were the instructor saying, "Good looking," giving a food treat and high-fiving the student.
Okay, so that is the example of a discrete trial. I would definitely encourage you to hop on YouTube. Oops, sorry, it's still playing. Let me go back and close that all down. All right, so I would definitely encourage you to hop online, especially on YouTube, and kind of look up some of these different interventions to find more videos and more examples of what they look like in practice. But that is it for this presentation. Again, make sure to finish your other online activities, and we'll be talking more about this in class on Monday. Thanks, guys.